How is it going, everybody? My name is Anton Dyball, also known as a Skeptical Human on YouTube, and joining me for our second debate on libertarianism is Andrew Gresock. He is a YouTuber who goes by the name of Philosopossum. Andrew, thanks for coming back for round two.
Not a problem, Anton. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed our first debate, but unfortunately
Great.
there was, time is limited. You can only talk about so many subjects, and in this
I
debate we're going
know.
to try to cover some of the ground that we didn't get to last time. So,
Sounds good.
uh, with that said, let's go ahead and start out talking about the non-aggression principle and
Sure.
government use of force as it relates to, collecting taxation, enforcing regulations, things of that nature. If you could just go ahead and outline your general position on that viewpoint, and then we'll just open it up and go from there.
Right, sure. So the non-aggression principle, anyone who has watched libertarian YouTubers or done research on libertarianism is probably going to be familiar with that term. Libertarians throw it around a lot, and that's sort of our underlying ethical principle. It's a deontological system of ethics. So if you're familiar with like Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative, it's kind of along the same lines. It puts emphasis on the sovereignty of the sentient individual, like you as an autonomous, self-aware individual. You own yourself. You have certain you have because of that you have rights that follow from that. And one of the things I also like to point out is that people often confuse the non-aggression principle with pacifism as a rejection of all force whatsoever. That's not entirely accurate. It opposes the initiation of force. So force for self-defense. Like if someone is about to steal my car or, beat the crap out of me, I don't have to ask them nicely to go away. I can, but generally it's the rejection of the initiation of force, and it puts emphasis on your right to defend yourself. And that would be the gist of the non-aggression principle.
Awesome. Yeah, the way I see it applied, uh, it often strikes me as sort of fallacious because you hear libertarians talk in terms of, especially as it relates to the taxation debate, where they'll say things like, if I don't pay my taxes, men with guns are gonna come and kick
Right.
my door down and drag me away to prison, and they just make it sound like there's so much violence associated with basic things like the IRS collecting income taxes, which just doesn't strike me to at all reflect the actual reality of the situation, because what really happens is your tax bill is due, you pay it. If you don't, there's like extensions and fines you have to pay and so forth. But men with guns, storming, like landing in a helicopter in your backyard and like kicking down your door and like beating you up with batons and dragging you away for the simple act of not paying taxes just doesn't at all match up with the reality of the situation. Really, when you think about like what situations prompt the government, police officers, and so forth to use force, it's in response to violent resistance that they're met with. So, if a police officer tries to come and take you away for some sort of crime, and then you try to stab him or shoot him or pull out a gun, then they'll react with force. But if you're just like sitting on your couch and they're like time to take you away to jail, there's not going to be much force involved. So it always strikes me as a bit fallacious to hear those sort of men with guns arguments.
Right, right. Well, two things I have to say in response to that. The first one is that we're not literally saying that if you don't pay your taxes, the IRS is immediately going to. You ever see the movie Blues Brothers?
No, I don't think so.
At the end, where these guys like there's basically this uh these group of musicians who are like wanted criminals, and they're on the concert tour, but they're trying to evade the police. And at the end, they have like when the police finally catch up to them, they have like tanks, helicopters, jet fighters, the army, marines just storming the building where they're at. Uh, Imagine you have an idea that's what libertarians think of, like, oh, if I don't pay my taxes,
That's
the
what it seems
army.
like sometimes.
Yeah. So libertarians aren't literally saying the IRS is. I'm sure you've heard libertarians compare the government to the mafia.
Right.
Like, we're not literally thinking if you don't pay your taxes, the IRS is going to send the Gambino brothers to your house or some shit like that. The point we're trying to make, though, when we say that is stuff like taxation is ultimately backed by force. Enemy law is ultimately backed by force, even if the force isn't immediate. So, So it's not like like you're sitting there on your on your porch rolling a blunt, rolling a blunt or rather, smoking some weed, and the cop comes up and says, "All right, you there, you need to put that weed away, or you need to come with me, or whatever." The cop isn't like, "Hey, if you feel like it, could you put that joint away?" Or, "Hey, I'm suggesting that you not smoke weed," or, "I'm suggesting you wait until you're 21 to have that beer." It's a recommendation. It's not. They're saying this is an order. You will do this, and if you don't comply on some level, there will be a gun involved. So that's sort of the point that we now within the context of taxation, when you're giving your money to a private business, more often than not, it's voluntary. It's because that private business provides a good or service that you want, that you like, that you're willing to pay for. So that's kind of when we say taxation is backed by force, we're not necessarily saying that the government's like coming out and threatening people with force overtly. We're just kind of saying that the reason we're paying isn't necessarily because we want the service the government provides. It's because we don't have a choice. Force will be introduced at some point. And the second point I wanted to make was the violence you're met with during your arrest, right? So let's say that I'm sitting on my couch minding my own business. It sort of has to do with the burden of justification. Of when going back to the non-aggression principle, you're saying that, well, if I'm sitting on my couch at home, right, and the police officer comes up and says, "Hey, you're not paying your taxes, so I'm going to have to arrest you. You're going to have to come with me," and I fight back, and I fight back against the cop, and I get shot by the cop, people would be like, "Oh, well, he wasn't complying with the cop's orders. He wasn't paying his taxes or whatever, so it's his fault." But when we change the context to say, if I were to say go to my neighbor's house and say, "All right, I demand this much of your paycheck, and if you don't pay, since you're not paying me, I sent my neighbors a letter saying you better pay me or else," and I didn't pay, so I go over there, walk into my neighbor's house with a gun and say, "All right, you're coming with me now," and they resist, and then I shoot them, and I say, well, they were resisting, right? I sent them a letter saying they owed me money. They never gave it to me. Most people would be like, I'm in the wrong. I would be in the wrong in that situation, even though I'm doing the exact same thing the government's doing. So that the issue in that case is sort of here's private sector morality and here's government morality. So that's sort of the issue in that case, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. I have a lot to say there. So
Sure,
let's start out, kind of just take it from the top. One
sure,
one thing I would say is that by the logic you're using, every law is backed by force. So
exactly.
it's like you could extend that same logic to any law, where you could say, like, ultimately, me jaywalking, in violation of these government laws, is backed by force, or insert any crime there. So it's like,
Right.
if there's not some sort of force ultimately behind our legal system, then how are you going to enforce these laws? Like, I mean, you kind of said it there, where you were like, a cop's not going to come up and just give you a gentle recommendation that you shouldn't be using illegal drugs or selling crack or murdering people. If all we had were recommendations where they're like, it'd be really nice if you didn't murder people, but if you do, I mean, we're not going to do anything about it, there wouldn't be any force behind those laws. And I think we would both agree, if there was no legal force behind our justice system, then if we'd see a lot more murders than if there are stiff penalties for it. So there has to be some sort of an enforcement mechanism to actually get people to comply with these laws. And the question I would ask is, why would you fight back? It sounds to me like whenever libertarians talk about this, what they're ultimately doing is implicitly advocating violent resistance against police officers who are just like normal people with families, and they're just enforcing the laws that we as a society have come together and agreed upon. And when you talk about that, where you're like, a cop comes and I start to fight back, the question I have is, why would you fight back if these are the laws we have in this country? And the final thing I would say is your comparison, where you're like, if I just went into my neighbor's house and threatened him and told him he had to give me money, and you're just introducing the sort of like neighborly shakedown where you just like show up at some dude's house. How is that comparable to the government enforcing laws? Because we come together as a society, we vote on what the laws are, our elected representatives enact them. That's not at all comparable to you trespassing on some dude's property, showing up unannounced, and just being like, "Listen, Mister, this is what's going to happen." I mean, that comparison, it's just ridiculous, frankly.
Right. So right off the bat, you ask why would a libertarian fight back against the cop? The simple reason is that somebody is demanding my money against my will. They're like, I never agreed to it. They're just saying, you owe me money. They're showing up at my house. They're saying, you because you're not handing over your money, I'm going to kidnap you. Basically, it's like there's a person arbitrarily demanding money from me, threatening me with violence, threatening to kidnap me. My right to self-defense kicks in, and it's like, yeah, I see your shiny badge and your fancy uniform, but you're just a plain Jane Homo sapien like the rest of us. You follow the same. The morality applies to you just as it does to the rest of us. So that's my response to that. And the other thing is, like I said, I know during our last debate we sort of got into whether or not I agreed to pay taxes, or whether or not I agree how exactly it is that I agreed to participate in the system. And you could make an argument that say, like, if you would take out a mortgage, right, for your house, right, and you don't pay your mortgage, the bank forecloses on your house. They send people to your house, to your house, to your movie. They say, this house is ours now. Get out. We're going to use force if you don't leave. You could make an argument that, because in that case, because I agreed to the mortgage, because I saw what the terms were, I signed. I'm on record having signed the mortgage, having agreed to it. I kind of saw what was coming, and you could, in that case, saying, yeah, I agreed to a mortgage, I didn't hold up my end of it, and now force is being used against me. In that case, you can make an argument that that person kind of deserves it. But because, in the case of taxation, because there isn't really a clear cut, hey, you agreed to this, the moral basis on which you're initiating that force is a bit more dubious.
Yeah, I totally see the point you're making. That distinction. I understand the point you're making. This gets back to the earlier disagreement we had in our last debate, where the point I
Right.
made was, in order to live in a society that has 300 plus million people, you have to have some sort of way to collectively make decisions. Because, if the standard we had was every single person has to agree with the decision being made, decisions never would be made. Nothing would ever get done. So the point I made was, that's why we have our representative democracy system, where within certain boundaries, where there, certain things you can't, certain lines can't be crossed, no matter what percentage of people support it. Within certain boundaries, we elect representatives. They ultimately pass the laws that most of us support, and that's the way our system is set up. And that does extend to things like taxation and laws and so forth. And as I argued in that last debate, if you don't like a certain law or a certain part of our system, the solution, I think, is to simply, activate for your viewpoints and try to get people elected to bring about the changes that you want. And I don't know, this whole idea of framing it like, well, because I personally don't agree with this one particular law, therefore, uh, fighting back or resisting taxation in some way almost seems like a noble cause, like analogous to, like, if there was like slavery. You describe, I think the exact term you used was kidnapping, where it's like, this guy's
Yes.
trying to kidnap me. It's like saying I just broke a law, saying I can't trespass or break somebody's windshield or beat somebody up, and the police officer's dragging me away. They're kidnapping me. I don't agree with this particular law about whatever it happens to be. So therefore, because I don't agree with the law, it's kidnapping, it's theft, it's, insert whatever negative descriptor you want there. And it just, I don't know. I feel like if taxation truly was the grave evil you make it out to be, like if it truly was comparable to something like slavery, where it's just unambiguously wrong, I feel like you'd see a lot more tax evasion going on, and you'd see a lot fewer libertarians actually participating in the system.
Right. So several responses there. Sort of taking it from the top, there isn't necessarily a trade-off between individualism and collectivism. Like, you can have people voluntarily coming together to say, all right, our community is facing this issue, let's do something about it. Or you can have voluntary, like, mutual groups that do things, nonprofits and stuff. So that's probably one response I'd have. Another response I would have is that, like I say, going back to the example of the bank using force to remove you from the house, right? Uh, I'm not necessarily saying that all force is illegitimate. I'm not even necessarily saying that all laws are illegitimate, because, like I mentioned before, not all libertarians are anarchists. You have a right to protect your person and your property, and anything you have the right to do, you can vest that right to somebody else. So because I can protect my person and property, I can vest to government the power to protect my person and property, or anyone else's person and property. And that's sort of why a lot of libertarians aren't anarchists. They believe that government in that scope can be considered legitimate. So the example you gave of, say, somebody breaking a windshield, or trespassing, or doing something that hurts somebody, yeah, a lot of libertarians would agree a police officer or anyone else really would have the authority to step in and take corrective measures, whatever the situation may warrant. Uh, more what our beef is mostly with is these, like, victimless crimes, like you mentioned, selling crack and stuff like that. And as far as what else was I going to say? Yeah, that's basically my position on that.
Yeah, if I could just let's use the crack example there, because I
Sure.
think it is a good one where I do agree that our drug laws need to be reformed, and I'm sure if we talked about it, that'd be an area where, for the most part, there'd be some strong agreements. I think
Right.
ultimately we should decriminalize. In fact, I go so far as to say that we should legalize drugs, because I think decriminalization doesn't go far enough. Because it
Exactly.
still leaves the drug trade in the hands of criminal organizations
Yep.
who engage in violence and adulterate the drugs and so forth. That's a separate conversation. The reason I bring
Exactly.
that up is to say, even though I disagree with our drug laws, my solution isn't to say, people being carted away to prison or slaves, and use all this dramatic language and so forth. It's to simply say we should change our laws accordingly. Um, so I don't know. I feel like that's sort of a different approach from the way libertarians talk about it, where I don't know, they sort of frame it in this very melodramatic way.
Right. Well, I think the biggest thing is, like I meant before, I did mention Immanuel Kant. I'm not, are you familiar with him?
Yeah, the categorical imperative, I assume, is what you were getting at, where it's like basically you should treat others in such a way that it's sort of like the golden rule applied
Yeah, it's a
more
fancy
broadly to.
philosophical
Yep.
golden rule. Yeah, but basically, one of the points he makes I wholeheartedly agree with is that morality should be logically consistent, right? There shouldn't be a group A gets this morality, but group B gets this morality, right? And that's kind of the thing, that I have the right, as a human being, I have the right to make decisions as far as what I put in my own body. Now, if you disagree with that, you can try and convince me not to use drugs, but it's ultimately my body, my decision, and I don't care what badge or uniform you wear. It's like this idea that something that would ordinarily be wrong is like, oh, no, 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 it's okay. I have the. It's like you're bossing me around. You're telling me what to put in my own body. You're kidnapping me. You're threatening me. But all of a sudden, oh, no, 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 it's okay. I have a badge. Oh, it all becomes moral now. Okay, okay, different morality for you. Okay, got it. That's kind of the idea we're getting at, is that
Well, yeah, different morality, because we have certain people we vest those powers into, where it's like you need people who can enforce laws. If it was just totally arbitrary, if I saw someone jaywalking and I just like tackled him and carted him away and just threw him in some room in my basement, obviously that wouldn't strike very many people as legitimate. So you
right.
have to have some group of people you vest these powers in. So I'm not really sure what you're getting at there with that. Ultimately, the way I look at it, as it relates to taxation, is if you just look at the big picture reason for why we have taxation. It's, we have all these different programs and services and agencies that need to be maintained. And if you have people who don't pay their fair share, ultimately what's going to happen is the standard of society is just going to decline. If you're not paying your taxes, then that means there's not going to be as much money to maintain our infrastructure and highways and keep the water treatment plant running and make sure that the meat factories are operating according to food, health, and safety standards. And you can just go on and on like that. There's not going to be money to defend our country collectively. So when people shirk their obligations, ultimately it does put people in danger, because if we don't have the military there, to protect us. Obviously, I'm not so naive as to say that's all our military does. I
Right.
have a lot of
Yeah.
critiques of our military. Don't get me wrong, but just as a general rule, the idea of like collectively defending our country against invaders and so forth. If you're shirking your responsibilities in that front to help collectively maintain that sort of thing, or as it relates to like water treatment or infrastructure or like earthquake warning systems or whatever it may be, ultimately there are consequences to that if a large enough percentage of people do it, to where it puts other people in real danger. If the tap water we're drinking is polluted with lead and all sorts of stuff like in Flint, Michigan, then ultimately what's going to happen there is people are going to get killed and people are going to die. So it's not just as simple as like the government is collecting money so they can fill their coffers and then just like laugh all the way to the bank. They're collecting this money so that they can provide real services that actually save lives, and there has to be some way of enforcing that. Otherwise, people are going to get hurt and people are going to get killed.
Right. So there's three responses I have. First one is, if the government was vested special powers that nobody has, where did they come from? Because nobody has them to vest. So that's my first question. Second point I'd like to bring up is that you mentioned that government provides all these services and infrastructure and these things that people benefit from. Well, if people benefit from them, if they're important, well, it's not like those things are going to go away if government stops providing them. It's like in the free market, when there's a demand for something, that creates an opportunity for someone to come along and profit from it. And the third point I want to make is that, let's suppose that for whatever strange reason only government could provide something. Well, it doesn't mean we still have to, go for threatening money from people. There are plenty of ways for the government to collect money voluntarily, and I mentioned this point in our last debate. We didn't really get too in depth with it, but if you look at stuff like toll roads, like the state of Maryland where I live, they're big on toll roads. As the state gets a huge chunk of its revenue from toll roads, and toll roads are voluntary. No one's saying you have to drive on it. Same thing with the post office, the lottery, government vending machines outside government buildings. The list goes on of just ways the government can collect money that's voluntary and non-coercive. So those are my three rebuttals there.
Awesome. So your first question, where do these government powers come from? The answer seems pretty simple. We collectively come together and we vote to decide to give them these powers. When we say we're going to institute a police force in our state and country and so forth, we're going to implement a military to defend us. So that seems like a no-brainer, frankly. Regarding where you said if the government stops providing these things, like the water treatment plant that prevents us from drinking poison and so forth, or the regulations that stop rivers from being so horribly polluted that people that swim in it or get their water from it or whatever it may be, they get cancer. If the government doesn't do that, well, the free market will step in and fill that void. The problem with that is that that free market approach would be entirely reactive, whereas the governmental approach is proactive. What I mean by that is, let's say we have that sort of free market system where it's like, oh shit, people start dying from horrible waterborne illnesses because the water treatment plant has no funding, and we're getting dysentery and cholera, and we're drinking lead and all sorts of stuff like that. Maybe now we should have some sort of free market solution to that where they step in and respond to it. How many thousands of people are going to needlessly die before that free market approach steps in, versus the government approach where we don't wait for the bodies to start dropping, we don't wait for the morgue to start piling up and the mass graves to be filled with all the people dying of diseases that we can't even keep up with. We look at the problems that could result, and we guard against them to begin with, so we don't even let these things happen in the first place. The pollution example is probably even the better one, because that's where it's just like, once the pollution starts flowing into the river, like, how, as I argued in the last debate, how many mass fish die-offs are there going to be? How many people are going to get cancer and die horribly from swimming in this river before there's enough public outrage about how horrible the conditions are that we finally come together to bring about some sort of voluntary solution to this or whatever? So the general point I would make in response to that is the governmental approach is proactive, which means it's gonna keep people much safer than the sort of after the fact, after the bodies are piling up, free market libertarian approach as well. And one final point, I'll just make it quickly.
Sure.
As I also argued in the last debate, your free market approach also strikes me as painfully impractical. Like having people somehow test the water on their own, and like test it against a chemical database and do all the research to determine which chemicals are toxic and which need to be taken out. That whole libertarian scheme and system just strikes me as totally impractical.
Right. Okay. So sort of going in respective order to all the points you've made. I feel the no brainer argument is kind of weak. It's kind of like saying, "Oh, this appears obvious, so it must be obvious." Like there's a lot of issues that on the surface seem obvious, but aren't so clear cut when you look carefully into them. Of course, the Earth appears flat because gravity makes it seem that way. But nowadays we know the specifics of how that works. There's a lot of things that's like, oh, this issue or a problem looks obvious, but when you look carefully at it and take it apart, you start to see it's not so obvious. Now, in the case of how where does government get its authority from? Like I mentioned before, the libertarians who aren't anarchists will make the argument that because you have the right to protect your person and property, you can vest another person that same right, and because of that, we can give government the power to protect your person and property. But if they have powers beyond that, where does that come from? And people, of course, people would argue, well, that comes from society or us as a collective, and that sort of raises what's called the Sorites paradox. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not sure. Let's hear it.
The Sorites paradox. Okay, so the Sorites paradox it comes from Greek philosophy. Sorites means heap. Basically, it's like you have a grain of sand. You have a couple grains. You have a grain of sand, and you have a heap. Now, these two things are obviously different. A grain of sand is obviously different from a heap of sand. But the point is, so suppose I add a grain of sand to that one grain of sand. Now there's two grains of sand. It's two grains of sand to heap. Now, how about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? Keep adding sand. So obviously, just having a bunch of little grains of sand there isn't a heap. But somewhere between these grains of sands and the heap, there's a threshold where we no longer just have a bunch of grains of sands. We have a heap. Now, obviously, if you can kind of see where this is going with the whole appeal to society and collective, it's how many. I can't institute a tax on my neighbors. Two people, if I get my neighbor to say, "Hey, everyone else here should have to pay for our free health care or whatever," he can't. We can't do that. 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. How many people? Added. What's the threshold where it's like, okay, now it goes from a mob basically demanding free shit from people to the society, the collective. So that's sort of one among many issues you have with the collective society rule or whatever. Uh, Now, in regards to the second point you made, that the free market is largely reactionary, uh, I highly disagree with that. First of all, you're kind of what you're kind of implying is that politicians have this magic clairvoyance that private sector entities don't have. I mean, private sector entities, because politicians they're the same humans as the rest of us. So it's not like a person in charge of a private company has no greater ability to look into to predict things happening, to assess risk than anyone else. If anything, there's more risk assessment done in the private sector because they personally take on those risks. The government's not directly taking on any risk. They can just say, "Oh, we're short on money this month. Just take more money from people's paychecks." There's where in the free market, it's like if something bad happens, that hits our bottom line. That hurts us. So if anything, because there's a profit motive, there's more of an incentive to have a contingency in place. Like insurance. Insurance is a huge industry for not just your car, your house, your business. Business insurance is huge. Because you can never predict every bad thing that'll happen. But what you're kind of implying is that the free market is completely incapable of taking proactive actions or foreseeing risk, and that's completely. Even a cursory look will just show you that is completely false. And as I mentioned, even if I did concede that only government can do these things, there are voluntary ways for the government to collect money. Like I think there's one toll bridge in my town. It's like something ridiculously cheap, like 50 cents a vehicle, and that pays for the bridge's maintenance several times over and funds several of our state schools. So that would be my response in that. I'll hand the mic over to you.
Awesome, cool. So regarding the heap arguments, where it's like,
Yes.
at what point does it become a heap or a grain of sand?
Yes.
Um, it like it's an interesting philosophical conversation to ponder that sort of
Right.
thing. But I mean, let's get real for a second. We live in a country. We live in a society. We live in the United States of America. So it's like, at what point does it become legitimate? I mean, I don't know. I feel like you're sort of making an abstraction out of something that's really simple and clear to understand. We live in a country. We come together. We decide what our laws are, and we enforce them. So I feel like you're needlessly overcomplicating this matter. And as it, you made one point that I thought was kind of interesting, where you said, it's
Yes.
not like these government regulators have this magical clairvoyance where only they can see that we need to guard against these things,
Right.
and the private sector won't be able to see these things. No, they don't have magical clairvoyance, but what they do have are clear guidelines. What they do have are laws to follow. What they do have are regulations where it's non negotiable. And they say, if the pollutants are this high, we take action. End of story. Whereas the free market, the sort of free market solution you're talking about, where the private sector comes together and they try to tackle these questions. They only tackle those questions and problems if there's consumer demand, if the money is flowing, if there's some sort of free market outpouring of funds to be able to pay for the sort of programs they're going for. And if that's not there, then why would the free market guard against these things? If there isn't the consumer demands to take proactive measures against some sort of like abstract pollutant that 99% of people have never fucking heard against, what free market incentive would there be to guard against that sort of thing, especially compared against that government system where it's just like, here are the laws, this is what we're going to test for, this is what we're going to do, that's the end of the conversation.
All right. So my rebuttals to those points are respectively this. First one is I feel like that's the is therefore ought fallacy. Like we live in a country or in a society, and our country and society works this way, and our government works this way, and that's how it is, and that's kind of, yeah, sure, that's maybe how it works, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it should work. Just because this is the way the system we have doesn't mean it's the best system out there. When you listen to anarchists, both the famous anarchists in history like Murray Rothbard and Lysander Spooner, and even contemporary anarchists like one of my favorite is Larkin Rose, they do bring up a lot of issues uh, like if something's immoral, like if something is immoral for one person to do, why does it suddenly become immoral for 51% of people to do it? And I just don't think that appealing to simplicity is going to make this problem go away. Like anarchism, like I'm not even an anarchist. I think there should be a government that carries out certain functions, but even I will say that anarchism is a point of view that holds logical weight, and it does need to be addressed. And you can't hand wave that away by just saying, "Oh, this is the system we have. You got to get real, man." Uh, so that's sort of, I just don't think that's a convincing approach to take if you want to, especially hardcore anarchists like Larkin Rose. Larkin Rose is to hell with anything involving government. So if you want to convince people like him, appealing to simplicity or the status quo is just simply not going to be convincing. So that's, and the other point I make is that uh, like I said, if something bad happens that hits their bottom line, they lose profit. So there's no, like I said, there's no such thing as a 100% perfect system that prevents any and all harm, government or private sector. Well, I think that a system where there's like a profit mechanism, like there's a, oh shoot, because like you said, companies will only take action once the harm happens. But that sort of approach implies that there's a period of time where they lose profit, they have to pay for damages or whatever. That creates sort of a period of time in which that company's losing profit. It would be in their best interest to ahead of time prevent that issue from happening. And we see this when companies do things like I mentioned, purchase insurance, or they do research on uh, where markets are going. Now, specifically to address the example you brought up of river pollution. Now, if I own like a resort or something by the lake, no one wants to. If that lake is nasty and polluted, no one's going to want to swim there, and I'm going to lose money. So it's in my best interest to take measures ahead of time to make sure that to ensure that lake doesn't become polluted, or if it does become polluted, that I have a contingency in place, a plan to follow out. That what that specific plan is may vary. Like I said, it's the free market. There's no fixed, set, right way of doing things. But the point being is that in the interest of preventing a situation where I lose profit, lose customers, lose the reputation of my business, there's something in place to stop that from happening. So that's sort of my rebuttals there.
Okay, so regarding the whole is-ought fallacy, where you say, uh, what I said there, where I'm like, look, at the end of the day, we live in a country and we have laws and they get enforced. You describe that as sort of the is-ought fallacy. Just because that's the way our system is, isn't the same thing as saying that's how it should be. Well,
Right.
it's not like that's the only argument I'm making here. I'm making the ought side of the argument as well, where I'm saying if the funding dries up, if we don't have these regulations, then the buildings will collapse. Then the food will be tainted. Then the environment will be polluted. Then the people will die. So there's the ought side of the argument for you.
Okay.
You also said regarding these companies where you're like, if something bad happens, then it'll hit their bottom line, and that gives them reason to take action accordingly. I feel like that right there, that basic principle where the company acts in this way, I feel like that is sort of a reactive approach. Like you listen to entrepreneurs and CEOs and executives talk about their job roles, and one of the most common words you hear tossed around is firefighter. What they're doing is constantly responding to problems. Here's a problem that's hurting our profits. Here we're losing sales. Here there's an issue with this factory or whatever. So it is a reactive approach when you actually look functionally at how companies act. I get the point you're making where you're like, well, it'd be in their best interest to guard against these problems ahead of time. But there you're implying that there's going to be some sort of company set up to deal with all these different problems. The point I was making is like when thousands of environmental pollutants, like used in all sorts of weird manufacturing processes and so forth, shit like that the ordinary consumer isn't going to care about, isn't going to know about. They're not going to be aware of, the toxicity level required to cause harm and cancer or so forth. Why would there even be a company to deal with such an obscure problem like that? The system you're setting up implies that there's like all sorts of entities set up that are tackling all these problems that regulators are. And I don't see how that would actually play out in the real world, I guess. Like why would there be the consumer demand to set up these companies that tackle every single one of these pollutants? I guess that's my question there.
Right. Okay. So, like I said, you're correct. Consumers aren't aware of all the issues they need to deal with, right? Like they're not aware of all the different chemicals that may be out there that could be in their products, that could be harming the environment, whatever the case may be. But like I said, anytime you have a problem, anytime you have something consumers can't do, that all that does is create a market for an entrepreneur to come along and take advantage of. So now, in the case of
That sounds reactive to me, doesn't it?
Well, right, but if you think about it, any system is going to be reactive to an extent. It's not like government is going to. It's not like these government regulators are like magically going to be like, this is a problem. Because like even then, when people argue for regulations, they usually say they point out some major event that happened, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory or whatever. They usually point to an event that says this is why we need this regulation. So a lot of these regulations, I think everything, any system you implement, it's impossible to be 100% clairvoyant. Any system you implement is going to be reactive to an extent.
Yeah, my response to that would be, in the case of the government, that's why we have agencies that test these different chemicals before you can start dumping shit in the river. We don't wait until the bodies start piling up to conduct a couple studies. For the most part, we have testing protocols in place where it's like, oh, you're going to use these chemicals in your factory and pour them into the environment. First, we need to issue all sorts of studies to make sure that it's compliant, that it doesn't harm the ecosystems nearby, that it doesn't kill people, or as it relates to like food and medicine, for example. If you start putting some shit in your food or beverages or medications or products that you're selling to people, you can't just willy-nilly do it and then it's like the bodies start dropping and then maybe we'll take action. So in that sense, the government approach is a lot more proactive, whereas in the libertarian system you're outlining, it seems to me it would be much more reactive, where it's like, oh, well, people are dying as a result of this company's product. Now it's time for the social media outrage campaign to hurt their bottom line and push them to change. So it does seem a lot more reactive, and I feel like you just can't get away from that.
Well, I mean, you can because like you said, it would be ideal to address the issue before it happens.
Hey, you're cutting out really badly. Can you
Oh,
hear
I'm
me okay?
sorry. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, go ahead and just start your response from the beginning.
Okay, so what you're saying is true in terms of it would be ideal to prevent this issue from happening before reacting to it after it's happening. But that's the whole point, though. Like it is ideal to protect from the problem to begin with. That's why private companies will do that. There will be private companies that will say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to because let's take a look what some of these government companies what this government agencies do that you say they inspect chemicals or they inspect ingredients in food to make sure they're safe to use before they're used. Well, if I'm in charge of a chemical company or food company, if I don't want to hurt my customers, because if my
What
customers
if it's cheaper
die,
to?
well, I'd save a little bit of money short term. Long term, it's like customers, because if the customers die, they're not going to be alive to continue buying my products. So that's
What if
that.
the problem takes 10 years to manifest? What if it's like months the case of Roundup for example, where it's this fertilizer that's being sold aggressively and you're not going to get cancer or Hodgkin's lymphoma or whatever it is after using it for a month, but 5-10 years down the line then people start dying. What if it's a situation like that where it takes a long time for the problems to manifest? Then and it's cheaper to do it that way. Why wouldn't that be the rational free market answer?
Well, because like I said, there will be other companies doing research, publishing reports. It's not it like that's not just because here's the disadvantage of the government system, right? It's like if FDA publishes there's only one FDA, and if I want to set up my own FDA, I can't really compete with. Well, I suppose I could provide a similar service, but as far as the specific regulatory powers, I couldn't start that myself. But let's say I want to compete with the FDA, I want to start my own food inspection safety company, whatever you want to call it, to publish reports and stuff. In a free market, I would be able to do that. I would be able to compete because you kind of have this idea that it's a monolith. It's like I'm going to sell this dangerous chemical that's dangerous to save a few bucks in production, and there's going to be this one uh, report publishing company that I can just influence or circumvent, or the case may be. Uh, that's that. Truth be told, that happens quite a bit under our current regulatory system. You think if you have the money to bypass the regulators, you have the money to bribe people, lobby people, hire lawyers, dodge this, dodge that. It's like that'd be much harder in a libertarian system where there's no longer just one monolithic gatekeeper like the FDA. There's now a whole bunch of gatekeepers that kind of peer review and bounce information back off each other. In my opinion, it would be harder to circumvent regulations in a free market than under government.
Let's take a step back for a sec because the
Sure.
example I gave where it's like you have a company that's selling some sort of fertilizer and down the line it might be cheaper to sell this fertilizer, but 10-15 years down the line then the cancer starts cropping up, and there it's a clear profit motive to sell the compound nonetheless because they invested so much money into the research and development and so forth. They're sort of all in on this. Your response to that was it was quick, but I noticed it where you were like, well, there'd be other companies doing research into these chemicals and so forth to
That's
publish reports. What if
yes.
it's a proprietary compound where they say you can't analyze this? It's proprietary. It's company knowledge. And if there's nobody there to test it, then who's going to step in and blow the whistle on the fact that it is actually harmful?
Well, libertarians don't believe in intellectual property or patents. Patents are really even a lot of progressives have a bone to pick with patents. They're just stupid. It's like so. In fact, that's another thing. Let's say that I wanted to start a company to compete with Roundup. It's like I could take but I wanted that advantage of not having it give you cancer after 10 years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snag their formula. I'm going to make the adjustments to where it doesn't give you cancer, and then boom, I have a market advantage.
Yeah, again, that implies that we know it gives people cancer, but without the testing that these government agencies do to make sure that these chemicals are compliant, it's like how would we know that it causes cancer 10 years down the line without those studies?
There would
That
still be like there would still be studies and testing. That's there's the
Done
demand
by
for
who though?
company like consumer protection companies or health reporting companies, whatever you want to call them. They're the private sector has all different kinds of
Who would pay?
examples.
Who would fund those companies though? That's my question.
So I have a company where I sell fertilizer, right? There's several potential answers to your question. One of the private right off the bat is like, I want you to buy my fertilizer. I want you to trust me. Suppose I'm walking into Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, and I'm like, shit, you know what? I want to buy fertilizer, but I hear that it has a tendency to give you cancer and shit like that, and I don't want it. I don't want to mess. I don't want to get cancer. So, how can I be reassured that the fertilizer you're selling me isn't going to give me cancer? Well, I can look at I can take your bottle, look at the bottle, see a little seal of approval from uh, probably like right now the biggest example is Underwriters Laboratories, but in a free market you probably have all different examples. So if this is the Johnson X safety board company approval seal, and there'd be a link on the bottle, give the URL to their website. You could go. Let's say that you know what? I'm not entirely sure if I trust this safety inspection company or whatever. I can go on their website, look up their reports, and other companies that compete with them, right? Because it's not a monolithic like our current regulatory structure. There's a good chance other companies doing the same thing will peer review it, and they'll have their own reports. Like let's say, like if I'm a competing company, a competing safety inspection company, and I think you're up to something fishy, like you're cutting people a pass if they pay you or whatever. I'm going to want to point that out. So there's going to be a shit ton of cross reviewing and peer reviewing, and the documentation's all going to be there at your fingertips to find. And in my opinion, that's a more robust approach to having just one monolithic regulatory agency that I can bribe, lobby, circumvent. You know,
Yeah, let me start out with a small point. I don't want to sidebar our
sure,
conversation. Just
okay,
regarding the whole don't believe in intellectual property rights point that you made, it seems to
yes,
me that is sort of a slight contradiction with this idea of like I own the products of my labor and so forth. Small point. Let's not get sidetracked there. So regarding the
okay,
whole seal of approval thing, where I'm like, who is going to pay for this sort of thing? Where it's like you say private companies are going to be doing the testing of chemicals, and my question was who's going to pay for it? And you gave us a scenario where it's like the dude goes into Home Depot and he's like, I suspect maybe this will give me cancer or something. So I want to make sure there's a stamp of approval, and he's going to go home and research it and so forth. I feel like that's demanding way too much of consumers to take it upon themselves to dive into the research and ascertain whether like one particular fertilizer and this compound in it and that compound and the 57 other compounds and chemicals inside of it mixed together and so forth. I feel like it's demanding way too much of them to take it upon themselves to research it and find out if it's safe or not. And then you have to multiply that out to all the different purchases we make regarding food and paints we're going to use and building materials and all sorts of different chemicals and solutions and compounds. So I feel like it's horribly impractical for people to have to like make these decisions themselves and like search for that stamp of approval. And my question would also be what's stopping these companies from just like spoofing this and just putting it on their packaging where they're like, well, we tested it ourselves. It's like some laboratory where it's like Genesis chemical certification said it's 100% safe, and perhaps that's like a parent company, perhaps that's like a subsidiary of the parent company that's producing the chemical. So I feel like they could just kind of spoof it and get around it pretty easily in that sort of system. And for most consumers, that would be enough to fool them.
right. So I guess the idea it comes down to the idea of you mentioned that consumers would have a little bit more responsibility, but in my opinion, that I think that's a good thing because we have the freedom that we have as consumers to make choices in the free market and to make decisions on what companies to support. And in my opinion, that little bit of extra responsibility for that freedom is in my opinion, worth it. Of course, you'll probably disagree with me on that, but I'd be willing to accept that little extra responsibility to preserve my freedom. The other point I would make is that a lot of it comes down to trust. Like we trust these private companies. Like I may not necessarily know everything there is to know, but that's why we have these companies here to inspect these things and to certify them and to prove them. And we have I was about to say, like we already have underwriters laboratories. A good majority of the products you buy aren't even inspected and approved by the government. They're inspected and approved by underwriters laboratories. So you could take a look at the bottom of any electronic device. Like I'll take a look at the bottom of my let's see here,
It's like
little.
inspected by the FDA. You're like, no.
Yeah, I have this little USB uh, uh, disk reader, right? So the disk reader built into my laptop stopped working. I had to buy an external one, but it says right there on the label, UL. Just hold up the camera so you can see it. Where was it? Underwriters Laboratories, a little UL symbol right there.
Right, so regarding the whole underwriters laboratories thing, this gets back to the point I made on our last debate where I'm like, sure, the government might outsource some of these things to private companies, but these companies are still operating within these government strictures and guidelines. They don't just hand it off to a company and they're like, do whatever the fuck you want. They say, here are the rules, this is what you need to follow, have at it. So again, that strikes me as different from the libertarian system you're outlining. The final point I want to make
Okay.
before we switch gears and talk about something else is we're having a very hypothetical sort of like top down conversation where we're thinking about what might happen if we had your
Right.
system and talking about it might work this way, it might work that way. We don't have to have a hypothetical conversation. All we have to do is look at early American history before we had these regulations that I'm talking about. The examples I gave in our last debate, where we discussed building and construction regulations quite heavily. The examples I gave, where I talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where the company locked employees in these dangerous conditions, surrounded by flammable materials. A fire broke out. There weren't regulations on sprinkler systems that were required and all sorts of fire suppression systems, and a bunch of people died horribly. A similar thing happened in the case of the Chicago Iroquois Theater fire, where 600 people died because, again, there weren't standards in place that they had to follow. And then there was that General Slocum ferry disaster, where a similar thing happened. A fire broke out on the ferry. They didn't have proper safety equipment or training, or there weren't guidelines on it, and people died horribly. And you can extend this outwards to all kinds of different areas where, you look at how pollution was back then, or you look at how water was making people sick, or the food factories were filthy and disgusting and giving people illnesses. We don't need to have the hypothetical conversation about what might happen, what might not happen. I feel like the historical test has already proven you to be wrong, and the corrective mechanisms we put in place to guard against these problems are, I think, living testaments to the failures of libertarianism. So I would ask, what's your response to that, and what are your final points on this question before we switch gears?
Yeah. So my initial response to that is that the reason libertarians tend to speak in hypotheticals a lot is because we don't know the answer. That's the thing. I think Larkin Rose said it, and I'm not quoting him exactly, but I think it's like I admit that I don't know the answer. I think people should be free to figure out what the answer is, and I'm not arrogant enough to point a gun at you and say this is the right answer, do it, right? And because everybody's situation, everybody's circumstances are unique, and that's sort of why a system that's flexible, I'm not saying there shouldn't be any consumer protection. I'm saying companies aren't gonna cut corners to screw over consumers. It'll earn them a profit, but definitely a system where there's flexibility to the circumstance because individuals are unique. I feel overall that's going to have the best results. And companies, not just UL, but also Consumer Reports, Yelp. There's medical companies that inspect medicine and pass reports. There's all different examples of private sector consumer protections. And I feel that if you look carefully at a lot of those things that happened, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, that happened in a place that was very anti-union. If you look at all the other places that are more union friendly, you didn't see conditions like that. The police, when union after the Triangle Shirtwaist fire happened, union protesters were on the streets demanding better conditions. They were stopped by the government police. So like I said, a lot of these situations just aren't so clear cut as people think, and that's why I think the free market is ideal, because that flexibility is there to the circumstances. Consumers and producers are free to make decisions, and that will, in my opinion, overall produce the best results. And that's my final thoughts on that point.
All right, so we're back after our brief little interlude, and for this next part of the debate, we're going to talk about social welfare programs, things of that nature. Just a brief reminder: my name is Anton Dyball. I go by a skeptical human on YouTube, and joining me for our second debate on libertarianism is Andrew Gresock, who goes by Philosopossum on YouTube. So during our interlude, I dropped a bombshell on Andrew, and that's the fact that I myself used to be a libertarian. Somehow I never thought to bring that up in our past debate or up until just now. I used to be a huge Ron Paul supporter. Like I was all over the subreddit. I was every interview that was uploaded. I was watching it. I donated hundreds of dollars to his money bombs, as they were called. I even bought thousands of the Ron Paul super brochures for the libertarians who know what those are, and I would go and hand them out to people and try to encourage them to vote for him. So I guess I'm just sort of curious. What are your thoughts on the fact that I used to be libertarian and now here I am debating against my own former views?
It's kind of shows you you never know what to expect. You never know where you're going to end up. And I hopefully if I can maybe welcome you back over, man.
Yeah, doesn't seem very likely, but maybe I
Right.
just drank a little too much Big Brother Kool-Aid, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what
You need some
pulled me to the dark
read
side.
some yeah read some Larkin Rose and Milton Friedman. You should be good.
Right. So let's go ahead and talk a little about social welfare programs. I think a good way to
Sure.
open up this conversation is to actually talk about a very famous Ron Paul moment, where during one of the 2012 Republican debates, he was
Yes.
asked a really good question by Wolf Blitzer, who basically said, uh, let's imagine in your libertarian scenario, you have people, freely purchasing their own health insurance plans. There's no government assistance in the space, no universal health care, no single payer. And people have to take it upon themselves to freely purchase health care. Let's say a man is very sick. He needs hospitalization. He needs emergency care, and he doesn't have a health insurance plan. He doesn't have the money to pay for it, and he doesn't have any friends or families or charities that are willing to help him out. The question he asked Ron Paul was, should society let that man die? And there were people in the audience who were cheering and they were like, yes, let him die. And that right there strikes me as a very clear illustration that at least some libertarians have an extremely callous view where they take this sort of every man for himself individualistic viewpoint to such an extreme level that it almost strikes me as disgusting. And I guess my question would be, what would your response be to that question?
Right, because I did address this in my response video, I made to your video, because you include that clip of from that
Hey, you're
Republican debate.
sorry, you're breaking up. Would you mind starting your answer
Okay,
again?
yeah, yeah, sure. So I do address this point in my response video that I made. Have you watched the response that part of the response video?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so basically, first of all, and I do point this out in the video, there were like two people cheering out of that whole crowd. So
Two
far
people too
from
many.
yeah, far from the consensus of libertarians as a whole. So right off the bat, I'll point that out. Second thing I'll point out is that I wouldn't let him die. I'm sure a whole lot of people wouldn't let him die. So I guess the answer is I'm concerned. You're concerned. Obviously, a lot of people are concerned. We just pull our money together and give it to them.
Yeah,
And they're
how would you learn about it though? Like that's just one example where we have this idealized scenario of the one man we're all aware of. But in reality, you look at the reality of healthcare in this country, and even under our current system with the government system that's poured into this, estimates show that there's 30 to 40,000 people that die each year from either a lack of healthcare or underutilization of the system due to concerns about cost and so forth. So it would be totally impractical for us to just constantly be scouring, websites like GoFundMe and so forth, and just and pouring money into every person who needs that sort of healthcare assistance. Given that so many people die in this country from lack of healthcare, and they have these obscene medical bills and so forth, it seems to me that we would have to have very deep pockets to be able to help every single one of them out.
right. So I should preface this by saying that I recently had to go to the hospital for something. So I'm stuck with that mass, and my insurance didn't cover it, so I'm still stuck with that massive bill. So this is by no means an issue I'm not sympathetic with. But one thing I would like to point out is in your video where you argue that taxation isn't theft or whatever. I know you use a clip from what's it called, Bit Butter, the blue cloud guy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, same channel, but they did a video kind of explaining what the healthcare system was like before Medicare and Medicaid and all of that. And before that, we had mutual aid societies, and we had charity doctors, and we had very cheap, low cost healthcare in this country, and it was very rare because of these programs that were funded by these mutual aid societies, charities, low cost doctors. There was a time in history when it was very rare for someone to die because of lack of medical treatment. It's not till the government comes in and they start what happened with Medicaid and Medicare. A lot of these, these small charity doctors and these mutual aid societies, they found that they couldn't compete. And there's other things the government did to kind of stomp on their feet, like the AMA requiring requiring licenses to practice medicine, and the FDA raising the price of certain drugs. And if you look at all these examples. In fact, another video by Shane Killian that I highly recommend is How to Fix Healthcare Without Spending a Dime. And he kind of lists out all these different ways to fix healthcare that are really effective, that don't involve any sort of expansion of government or big government.
Uh, you talk about how basically it seems to me that what you're doing is, for the most part, blaming the government for our healthcare problems in this country, which frankly strikes me as
Yes.
laughable because if you actually look at the problems that I'm talking about, where it's not the government who's the one who's constantly trying to find out new ways to deny you claims and deny paying for your coverage. Health insurance companies, they come up with all these different absurd loopholes for why they don't have to pay for somebody's healthcare treatments. Pre-existing conditions, for example. That's a great example where they just find every possible instance in your medical history where they can point to it and say, for this reason, we're not going to pay for your health care. It's not the government that's doing that. It's the private health insurance companies. It's not the government who's charging 2 to 3 times for pharmaceutical drugs what other countries charge, where they have systems where they negotiate drug prices with these insurance companies. It's the pharmaceutical companies who are trying to extract as much profit as they can for the system. It's not the government who's jacking up the premiums and the deductibles for these private health insurance companies. It's the private health insurance companies trying to make as much money as possible. So you hear this talking point a lot where it's like, oh, if only the government would get their hands out of the healthcare system, then we would really see an improvement in our healthcare system. It's a complete reversal of the facts, because if you look at the key problems in our healthcare system, it comes from under-regulation. It comes from giving these companies the freedom to charge whatever the fuck they want for pharmaceuticals. And this lack of negotiation that's written into our laws makes it so that we pay so much more than these other countries. And so I think you're inverting reality completely on its head.
I disagree. If you look at a lot of the data that we have, well, first of all, you mentioned a lot of these big companies do things that like deny health insurance claims and sell overpriced drugs. Yeah, it's true. A lot of these companies do these shady types of practices, but they usually get away with it though because of the government. So people typically don't want to. Nobody wants to buy a health insurance policy that's going to deny all their claims. Nobody wants to spend $700 on a drug that does that on a drug. That only costs $50 to produce. Nobody wants to do these things. They more or less have to because there's government regulations in place that uh, either that make it easier for these companies to do this. Like there's laws that force you to pay. Like I think Obamacare makes it mandatory that you have health insurance. So right off the bat, these health insurance companies, they're getting demand that they wouldn't have otherwise. And then there's another law, and Shane Killian points this out in his video, How to Fix Healthcare Without Spending a Dime. Awesome video, by the way. Very, very, really do recommend it. But one of the points he makes is that there's laws in place. Like, let's say I live in Maryland, right? Let's say there's a company up in Pennsylvania that's able to offer me a really good deal on healthcare insurance, like way better than any company in the state. Well, according to the law, I can't do that. I have to, the way the law works now, I have to buy all of my health insurance in state. and that really reduces the competition and the ability of a consumer to shop around and see where they can get the best deal. And another thing is that I discussed previously how the FDA increases the price of medication, but the thing is that the government does, to a large extent, dictate the prices that we pay for medication, not directly. Like I know a lot of people, progressives, they want a system where the government does that directly, where they negotiate the price of medication. Our government does it indirectly by having the FDA give monopolies basically to certain companies, and I can look up examples of it. There's quite a few of them of the FDA giving letting special companies have an exclusive right to sell this drug, or patents. Patents are another example. Like if I come up with a medicine, I can get a patent on it and say this is mine. Nobody else gets to sell it. And that's why there's a story of a little kid in Florida that got bit by a poisonous snake. They had to get rushed to the hospital. They had to pay something of like I think it was like a couple grand for this little jar of antivenom, because there's only one company that produces this antivenom that they need. And I have a feeling if other companies are able to produce it, that would be a lot less.
Awesome. Yeah. So some interesting points were made there. Let's take it from the top. You
Sure.
said you said these problems I outlined, where private insurance companies deny claims every so forth. You said they get away with this because of the government. No, I'm sorry, they get away with this because of a lack of government. If you look at other countries in Western Europe, for example, that have more progressive healthcare systems, countries with single-payer healthcare systems, or mixed models where there's a much stronger government role, what you see is that they do not have these problems that we have here. I'm not saying they're completely blemish free and there aren't
Right.
improvements that could be made in other areas, but if you look at these key problems I'm talking about, they're unique to the United States because we have a uniquely deregulated healthcare space where these companies have so much free reign to act as they want. Regarding your particular critique where you're like, well, granting exclusivity to these pharmaceutical companies causes some issues, and if you didn't give them these patent rights, that could improve the situation. I'm not rejecting the idea that there are some sort of like free market improvements that could be made to our healthcare system. Like in that one particular area you cited there, perhaps I'd be okay. I'd have to look at the specifics. It's hard to just talk about
Right.
it sort of in the
I could
general
see if I
sense.
could find up the news article and send you a link to it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just saying, like, as a general rule, I'd be fine with opening it up to where other companies can compete in the space and so forth. Part of the problem, though, isn't where it's like, oh, it's the dastardly government that's the problem. Part of the problem is startup costs to actually start a pharmaceutical company are so insanely high that it's not the sort of competitive niche where some entrepreneur in his garage can just start a pharmaceutical company. You need tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars to fund the studies, to develop these drugs and so forth. And so that's one of the problems where when you leave it in the private sphere and you don't have, for example, government agencies that produce drugs. Like other countries, for example, they'll have government manufacturers where they produce generics and stuff like that that's much cheaper. And the reason that works well is because the high startup costs preclude other companies from entering the space. So it's not exactly like a monopoly, but it's similar to a monopoly in the sense that it's so hard for other companies to enter the space that just saying like open it up to the free market, it might sound nice in principle, but in reality it just wouldn't actually work that way.
Right. So my initial response to that is that innovation, to a large extent, drives prices down. So obviously, when a new technology or new technique or something initially comes out, it's usually really expensive. Like there was a time when back in the 1950s, like in like the 1940s, if you wanted a TV in your house, it would be as much as a car, But because of innovation bringing prices down, production costs go down, and things that were once like luxuries are now everybody has them. And I have a feeling there'd be a good chance. Yes, uh, the process of researching and producing pharmaceuticals as of right now is a bit high, but
It's enormously high. It's not a bit high. Tens of billions of dollars. I mean, the startup costs are just like obscene.
right, right. But I have a feeling there's a few things you could do. Like I said, biggest thing is I think would work is innovation, competition, bringing prices down, especially in an environment where there's less legal red tape. Like a big chunk of that cost is just the process of getting a new drug tested and approved by the FDA is really expensive, really time consuming. And of course, I'll mention it again in Shane Killian's video, how to fix healthcare without spending a dime. He makes that point that a big chunk of that cost of producing medicine just comes from the FDA's red tape they have on the pharmaceutical market. If there's a way we can improve that and improve the process by which drugs are tested and approved, that's one potential way to slash costs right then and there. But then you also have competition from other companies wanting to find cheaper, more effective ways to produce these medications. And then of course, if we don't have this insane war on drugs, people may be more free to experiment with their own solutions. Like I know that a lot of people grow marijuana for pain relief and other types of medical purposes. We'd see much more of that without this stupid war on drugs. So, and of course, in a system where not to kind of get tangential and talk about the Fed and everything, but in a system where currency is more decentralized and banking's more decentralized, it may be easier for a new company to obtain that startup capital. So there's a variety. The point you're making is genuine, but there's a variety of solutions to implement. Just like any other issue in the free market, there's usually a multitude of different ways to address a problem.
Yeah, the first part of your answer struck me as deeply unsatisfying, to say the least, where I brought up these, I would argue, very legitimate problems with this idea of, oh, competition will solve the problem, and you basically just responded by saying, well, innovation will drive prices down. That's very
It
vague.
always does.
I don't think it's good enough to just toss out a buzzword like innovation as if that somehow nullifies the critiques I just brought up. But that's kind of a small point. More directly regarding the point you made about where you say, well, a lot of these costs come from the regulations and the red tape. Good move, clever move, I have to say. But I would respond by saying, number one, I don't know the exact statistics on this, so I can't give like a detailed response to that regarding like what percentage of the money that they spend goes towards regulatory compliance versus what goes to like paying their employees and executives and like paying for advertising and marketing, and what percent goes to profits and what percent goes to R&D. I don't know what the exact breakdown is, so I can't really speak to that particular part of it. One thing I would say though is these regulations are there for a reason. The FDA, they don't set up regulations on like you need to test your drug and make sure it's safe because it's funny to them, or they're not doing it to fuck with us. They're doing it because we need to make sure that these drugs aren't going to have unintended side effects that end up killing people or make the problem worse and so forth. So I would argue regulations like this, while it's easy to just point at red tape and say that's the problem, the red tape is there for a reason, because without it, people could end up taking drugs that could cause some serious issues. And the final point I would make is regarding the spending in these areas. A big chunk of the spending goes towards profits, goes towards marketing and advertising, goes towards executive bonuses and compensation, things that other countries they don't have, or even where they do have a private sector, they don't have it nearly to that extent, because we have such a predominant private role in our healthcare system. That's tons of money being spent wastefully. Like, who the fuck needs to see commercials for boner pills and stuff like that when they're trying to watch a football game or something, All of this money could, and I would argue should, be spent actually providing healthcare and not trying to market your drugs like it's some sort of commodity, like the latest automobile that you're going to buy or something. I think healthcare is one of those unique spaces where, because it's a clear matter of life and death, simply treating it as just another space where it's like consumers are purchasing commodities and services doesn't capture the grave reality of what healthcare actually is all about.
Well, the first thing is that marketing and advertising for medication is important. I would say that if I'm suffering from a illness and someone's potentially selling something that can help with that, I want to know that. So, I'd argue that advertising and marketing for drugs is a very good thing, because now the people who need these drugs know that they're out there and have a way of knowing where they can get them. And it's not like the money they spend in advertising is just vanishing. That when companies spend money on advertising, it's an investment. So they'll put X amount of money into advertising, and that drums up this amount of, like, let's say I put $500 in advertising, but that drums up an extra $1,000 in business. That's a net $500 I got from the advertising. So it's not like advertising is a black hole where the money vanishes.
Fair
If that
point.
was the case, nobody would advertise, right?
Right.
But I would say it's the opposite. I'd say marketing and companies should vigorously market and advertise their drugs, because people who are out there suffering from these problems that these drugs could help can know that they're out there, and in my opinion, that's a good thing. Now, regarding your other point of saying that Medicare of healthcare shouldn't be treated as a regular commodity, this is I understand the sort of the rationale behind that, because I've heard this argument made frequently by people on the left. They say that, well, because healthcare is life or death, or because it's serious, we shouldn't treat it as a regular commodity. And my response to that is that that's kind of a misunderstanding of how economics works. It doesn't matter how you treat it, right? It matters how reality treats it, and the reason. And I know that's a bit of a bleak or cynical kind of approach to take, but economics is called the dismal science for a reason. The truth is that the resources that you need resources, you need chemicals to produce the medication, you need the time and labor from the doctors, you need the uh, equipment for the hospitals, you need the gasoline for the ambulance, you need food for the cafeterias, you need research for and testing resources for these drugs, you need all different kinds of resources are needed from the for the healthcare, Medicare, and all of this types of stuff. And it's not like, oh well, because it's not like reality is like, oh well, this is for a good cause. So you get an exception to the scarcity principle. You get an exception from supply and demand, because we you know, I think Ben Shapiro is famous for saying, "Facts don't care about your feelings." And I'm sorry to say it, but yeah, unfortunately, at the end of the day, healthcare is a commodity. It's something that there's a demand for, that there's not enough resources to satisfy for everybody, and that's just the reality. As much as we'd like to think that it can be treated differently from other commodities in the economy, it simply can't. And I think a realistic approach to, because I'm all for improving access to healthcare. I'm all for making it cheaper, more accessible. I'm absolutely 100% in favor of that. But I think treating it as if it were something, treating it as if it were some sort of exception to economic realities is going to hurt the availability of healthcare more than help it. I think focusing on this idea on the market-based solutions is probably going to be just from a very realist perspective, the best avenue to take.
Awesome. So we'll just go sort of in order here. So regarding the whole
Sure.
marketing and advertising thing, frankly, I think that's what doctors are for, where it's like, I don't need some TV commercial in between the football game to tell me about a certain medication. That's what my physician is for. That's a small point. I don't want to get sidetracked with that. The
Sure.
bigger thing that I would like to respond to is where you basically say healthcare is a commodity, whether I like it or not. It's the economic reality. Frankly, I think
Yeah.
you're the one that doesn't understand the economics here, because demand for healthcare is largely inelastic. You know, if I'm dying and I need some sort of life-saving treatment or medication or whatever, I'm gonna have to get that, assuming I don't want to die or suffer horribly. So, in where healthcare demand is elastic, where there is that sort of decision people make where they're like, maybe I should forego this medical treatment or skip the surgery that I need or not get the medication, where demand actually is elastic for healthcare, people end up dying. That's not the kind of system that I think we should strive for, or talk about as if it's some sort of inevitability. And one of the most frustrating things in healthcare conversations with people who are libertarian or right wing is they talk about it as if the sort of system progressives are advocating is some sort of hypothetical pie in the sky reality that doesn't match up with economics. No way it would ever possibly work. When this is the standard, this is the norm in other developed countries. We are the outlier here in the United States. Our shitty, terrible system, ours is the one that other countries point to and laugh at and say, this is unbelievable. How do they stand for this? So let's not talk about the system I'm advocating as if it's some sort of some sort of hypothetical based upon a misunderstanding of basic economics and in a naivety in that area, because other countries exist that have the systems and they do much better than us in terms of the quality of care, in terms of the percentage of people that access healthcare, in terms of healthcare outcomes, in terms of cost. Every important metric, these countries generally as a whole, they tend to outperform us. You can point to like localized things, like Ben Shapiro, for example, in one of his debates. He points to like this painfully a specific metric where he's like, well, in the narrow specific area of 5-year outcomes for this one particular type of cancer, we do better in the United States. And people applaud, like, yes, he cherry picked one specific thing. Like anybody in any healthcare system could do that. But if you look collectively as a whole, these other countries, number one, they exist. And I would like to hear conservatives actually acknowledge that, or libertarians in your case. And number two, they outperform us in these key areas.
Right. So I'll respond to each of those points you made in order. First of all, yes, healthcare is and it does have an elastic demand, but that doesn't mean that the rest of economics is out the window. Healthcare is inelastic demand. Okay, that great. That means that supply and demand, that scarcity, none of that all that goes out the window. No, no, it doesn't. I mean, that you still got to kind of deal with that kind of stuff, right? So that's what. So you still kind of, it may be a different nature of a commodity, but it's ultimately still a commodity. I mean, of course, you could make that argument. I wouldn't disagree with you necessarily if you want to say that there's a different type of nature to it. I would agree with you on that. But to say that, oh, economics doesn't apply here is kind of not really how the reality of it works. And the other point I want to make up, and Shane Killian mentions this in his video, how to argue for universal health care. He says when a lot of people complain about the American, a lot of people complain about the American healthcare system, and I think this is something we can both agree on. I don't think either of us really like the American healthcare system. I don't think anybody, progressives, libertarians, I think a handful of conservatives, but even then, only a fraction of them like it. A lot of people do not, all over the political spectrum, do not like the American healthcare system. But it's far from and he points out, it's far from what libertarians have in mind, a fully privatized, deregulated system. We don't have that. So you can't really look at the American healthcare system and say this is what libertarians want, because it's absolutely not. If you look back to if you look back to before stuff like the FDA and the AMA came along and saw when healthcare was cheaper, there were a shit ton of charity doctors, medicine was cheaper, the deaths due to lack of healthcare were at an all-time low. You start to see that now. That's what libertarians want, not what we have now. Now, in regards to the other systems, you say that libertarians never look at other countries that have single payer systems. We do. We do look at those types of systems, and we look at those, and we see the lack. You say that in American insurance companies tend to deny claims. That tends to happen a lot too in these other countries that have these socialized healthcare systems. There you see longer wait times. You see people being denied treatment because hospitals are filled up. You see a lot of things mired down in bureaucracy. You see a lot of these same problems that people blame the American system on, but in a lot of cases worse. Like there's another YouTuber. His name's Libertarian Scotty. He's from Scotland, so he deals with the NHS, and he makes a ton of videos saying all these Bernie people saying America should be more like the NHS. He says, no, you don't. I deal with the NHS. You do not want it.
All right, so regarding your claim that claim denials, they happen in these countries as well. I'm sorry, but that's simply
Yes.
not the case. You show up in countries with single payer healthcare, and you get your healthcare. It's free at the point of service. Everything is funded through your taxpayer dollars. You show up and you get the healthcare you need. Regarding the whole wait time arguments, now this is something I dived really deeply into, and it's not nearly as simple as people on the right wing make it out to be, where they just say like, oh well, if you do this, it's going to have longer wait times. Not nearly as simple. There's a bunch of different countries that have huge variation in their wait times. If you look at the specific different areas of healthcare regarding waiting for a surgery, regarding waiting for how soon after you make the phone call you can actually be there physically for your appointments, regarding how long you wait for the appointments. If you take all these different areas where there's potential for waiting and you sort of look at them collectively among the different countries, there's variation. In some areas, the U.S. outperforms single-payer countries. In other areas, the U.S. does much worse. In some areas, countries with mixed models do very well. In some areas, other areas, single-payer countries do well. So the basic point is that it's not nearly as simple as it's made out by conservatives, and I would highly recommend that people actually carefully look at the data and information on this instead of just like taking that talking point for granted, because frankly the data doesn't really bear it out. Now, taking it a step back, where you basically at the outset you were like, well, most of us agree that we don't like our healthcare system and so forth. Frankly, the point I would make is the only people who like our system are the people who, number one, either profit from it, or number two, simply don't
Yes.
have to interact with it. Because as soon as you actually need to go to the hospital, like you just did recently, and then you have to come to grips with the reality of claim denials from these private insurance companies and so forth, and then you have to pay thousands of dollars for shit that in other countries would cost you like $26. Uh, as soon as you actually interact with our system, you see how terrible it is. And the final point I would make is, you said, well, this sort of system isn't what libertarians want. So, in that sense, maybe I'm sort of straw manning you by pointing to the flaws in our system. I would agree, our current system isn't what you want, but I would say what libertarians want is to take the problems with our system and open it up to where the problems can become so much worse. Because if you're giving these companies free reign to charge whatever the fuck they want, without any sort of government regulation or whatever, things are going to get more expensive, and it's going to be even worse, and there's going to be even more claim denials. So opening it up to the free market isn't going to solve these problems. It's going to make it worse, especially when you consider my earlier point that startup costs sort of eliminate that the sort of competitive aspect that libertarians talk about, where they're like, well, other companies will step in and enter into the space.
Right. So I think when we were discussing, like I didn't like when I said that this system isn't necessarily what libertarians want. I gave some examples of things that libertarians were advocate for, like 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 charity doctors, less stringent regulations, more options as far as whom I can purchase my health care from. And I'll admit, maybe I don't know all the information about these other countries and what contributes to their wait times. Like, I'll be intellectually honest and admit when I don't know everything, all the facts, all the relevant
So
facts.
so why repeat the talking point then, if you don't know what the actual facts are?
Well, I don't know all. I don't know all the details as far as what causes the. I do. I will say though that I do know some of the basic economics of if you make something artificially cheaper, there's going to be more. There's going to be a demand spike, and when there's that demand spike but no uh, corresponding supply spike, costs go up, and of course, and those costs don't disappear because they're being handled by the government versus the private sector. So that's an issue that you kind of deal with in those types of single. Like I think you mentioned. I know you advocate for a single payer type system where the government kind of steps in and says, "All right, we're paying for everything. Don't worry about private insurance, or I guess it'll be supplemental. Some
Right.
people advocate for. You're right, because I think even you made that point in one of your videos. You advocate for a supplemental type private insurance on top of Medicare for all. But a lot of the times it's like the prices are no longer determined by by the ability of the consumer to pay. When the consumer's paying, the doctors and all them, they kind of take into account what the consumers can afford to pay. Now it's like there's this big bureaucracy comes along and says, "Here, money, give them health care." Now it's like the prices that they pay, they're no longer really cut. The ability of the consumer to pay doesn't really come into account, so they can just be like, "Oh, um, well, all right, let's charge whatever then, because consumers not paying for it. Why should we care how much it costs?" So that's one potential issue. Yeah, you see in a lot of countries that implement single payer type systems.
Yeah, it's maybe in the hypothetical scenario you outlined there, it's a potential issue. In the real world, though, you actually look at the costs in these countries and you see they're dramatically lower than what we pay in the United States. Look at countries with either single payer systems or heavily regulated mixed systems with a much stronger government role, and you see they pay much less all around the board. So you're talking about it like, oh, opening it up to where the government pays for it, prices are going to skyrocket. Complete reversal of the facts.
Right. So if you look at the data of these countries, like, oh, they pay less per person in healthcare. You kind of have to also look at what they get from it, and the service in a lot of these countries is, from what people describe, not quite as good. Like you'll see people will be coming to America to get healthcare, or they will be, like I think there was one person in Britain, they broke their leg, and I think it happened in Wales. They broke their leg, and they had to wait like 9 hours for an ambulance, and it's like there's your NHS.
I'm sorry, this is just another example where you're repeating talking points where the data just doesn't at all bear it out. I made a video where I looked very, very closely at all the statistics, all the data, all the information available on this question of medical tourism, which is the point you brought up, where you're like, well, people come to the US for care. I took a very close look at the subject. What you find is more people leave the United States to go to other countries for healthcare than actually come here for healthcare by a very large margin. Because our healthcare system is so insanely expensive, there's this outpouring of people going to countries like Canada or overseas to access healthcare. And so we have to get past these talking points, and we have to actually look at what the data is on these points, because it just doesn't bear it out. It like I'm not denying that there are people in some situations who come to the United States maybe because like they want to go to the John Hopkins facility for this treatment or whatever it may be, or the Mayo Clinic, for example. They have a lot of good doctors and like cutting edge technology there. I'm not denying that people come here for care, but you have to look at the big picture. Medical tourism is something that happens where people in all sorts of countries go to all sorts of other countries for all sorts of different reasons. And if you look at the data specific to the United States, the trend is for way more people to leave to access other countries' healthcare systems than from people in other systems to come here to our system. So the data, again, you're completely reversing the facts. You're just repeating talking points. And I would strongly encourage everybody to look at the data on this question because it doesn't bear it out. Similar thing regarding the quality of care thing. You just sort of loosely tossed it out there where you're like, well, if you look at what they're actually getting in these countries, the service is inferior, the quality of care is not so good, and so forth. Again, that's another one of those things where if you look at the data, it paints a totally different picture. There have been all sorts of studies that look at the quality of care using a bunch of different metrics in terms of like post-surgery complications, in terms of recovery rates from surgeries, in terms of like strokes after certain procedures, all sorts of very specific quantifiable metrics where you look at what is the actual quality of care people are receiving. And again, it's a totally mixed picture. Some of these countries with single payer systems, with mixed models, they outperform the United States in some areas, underperform in other areas. It's a mixed bag. It's just not as simple as you make it out to be.
Right. And the other thing you have to consider is sustainability. So I know you mentioned perhaps per capita, healthcare spending per person may be lower in countries that have single payer systems, or whatever you call it. Be that as it may, that doesn't necessarily mean it's capturing the full cost of the system. Like I remember there was someone brought up an example of France. In France, someone had to have a expensive procedure done, and they mentioned, oh, it only cost like $11, where it would cost way more in other places in the world. And it's like, yeah, but if you look at France's economy and their healthcare system, it's unsustainable. It creates no profit. It drains the economy. It increases their debt, and their taxes are high, and it's like the system may work now, but it's a system where everything's sort of going through the government, where it's not really earning a profit. How long can that go on for? Systems that increase the debt, because that even in other countries like Greece and Spain, you see an increase in debt, largely due to healthcare.
Wow, so much to say there. Okay, so regarding
Okay.
this whole idea of sustainability, where you're like taxes
Yes.
are high. Yeah, taxes are high, but per capita spending on healthcare is dramatically lower in this country. It's not enough to just be like, oh, well, they're paying more in taxes. Yeah, but if you look at the amount we spend per capita in the United States on healthcare, it's like double what these other countries pay. So it's like, yes, they're paying more in taxes, but overall, they're spending like half what we spend on healthcare. And on top of that, it's like, yeah, they're paying more in taxes in these countries, not just for healthcare, but for all sorts of different social welfare programs. But countries like this consistently rank within the top 10, 15 on happiness index, on any sort of surveys that ascertain how satisfied people are with their country, their government, their living situation. So if it really is as crushing and terrible as you make it out to be, why is it that these people so consistently say they're happy with their system? Regarding this whole idea that it increases the debt, again, this is a fundamental mistake that people on the right wing make, where they say reducing our healthcare costs is unaffordable. We can't afford to spend less money, is ultimately what you're saying. It's going to increase our debt to spend half as much as we spend on our current healthcare system. It's a complete nonsensical argument because, again, these countries spend radically less than we do. And you talk about it as if it's unsustainable. Really, well, I mean, a lot of these systems have been operational for decades in these countries, and they're outperforming us, and people are very happy with the system, and they're running along just fine. So I'm not sure where you're getting that from.
Well, I mean, of course, there's going to be mixed results when you look at it. So, but anyways, the other point I was bringing up was that in a lot of these systems, there may be wasted resources because consumers aren't necessarily free to decide the insurance policy that they want. So you may be spending more on insurance than you really, so a healthier person may not need as much coverage as opposed to a person with certain
Hang on, if I could just
conditions.
stop you, I feel like you just totally
Sure.
dodged all the points I just made there about how, yes, taxes are higher, but they spend less. Yes, taxes are higher, but people are much happier. I feel like you just totally ignore that point I just made.
Depending on what data, because there's
How about the World
be,
Happiness Index for the past like 10 years, which consistently shows these countries are like within the top 10? Let's take that for an example.
is that entirely because of healthcare? Because there's other things that could come into play when considering uh, the quality of
Well, let's just
happiness.
say it's the general like questions that ask like how happy are you with your government, with the taxes you pay versus services you get. Yeah, the World Happiness Index, it's general, but it's like it's the whole system that they live within, which is a system that you seem to be opposed to, where you're like all these government programs, the higher taxes and so forth. If the data consistently shows people in these countries are much happier with it, then how is it the problem you make it out to be?
Well, actually, a lot of these countries actually have some of these countries, and I know I mentioned that some of them higher taxes. Some of them actually have lower taxes than the United States,
Okay,
and they
well, what
still.
about the ones that have the higher taxes though? Because that's what I'm talking about here.
Hmm. Well, that kind of presupposes that they wouldn't be happy if there was something else in place. Because let's say we have this one system that makes them happy. Perhaps there's another system out there that would make them even more. Let's because I'm having doubts about how you measure happiness exactly because
You
I
ask
don't know. It's
people.
like and they give you a completely. You ask them something as vague as how happy are you, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
and they
like
give you.
on a scale of 1 to 10, for example. How happy
Oh
are
yeah,
you in these
that's
specific
that's
areas? I mean, the
that's
people who do these surveys, like they know what they're doing. It's not like this is just.
that's so scientific.
I mean, have you read these reports? Have you looked at the World Happiness Index reports? Because
I have. I've looked at data from the Heritage Foundation, and we see consistently uh, more economic freedom, less taxes and regulations.
I'm not
There's
talking about the
higher
Heritage
GDP.
Foundation. I'm talking about the World Happiness Index specifically, where it's not a partisan conservative think
Yes, and a
tank.
lot of
This
them. Yes,
it's
and a
just an
lot of them.
organization where all they do is they just go out and they ask people how happy are you with your system. It's a simple, straightforward report. There's no
Yes, and
conservative bias or anything like that, and the data consistently bears out exactly what I just said it does. And it seems like that completely undermines the case you're making, where you say, well, if we do all these things, you said it's unsustainable. You said the taxes are high. It's crushing debt. It's going to lead to ruin, like Greece or whatever. And I just pointed out to you that the data completely undermines that. And I just, it seems to me that there's really no good way out of that for you.
I'd have to look at the data so I could give you carefully scrutinize it. But I will say this, that if you if you look at other conflict, because there's other sources that will suggest that an increase in economic freedom leads to more happiness, more prosperity. So there's a lot of data that kind of counters that as well out there, and I feel like you're kind of like ignoring that.
Yeah, I mean, number one, the data you're pointing to is coming from very obviously partisan organizations that are agenda driven. I mean, the Heritage Foundation is it's it's an organization that obviously has a right leaning bias. So to point to them as if their data is like comparable to and equal to these impartial organizations that just go out and ask like run of the mill survey questions, I don't think it's a fair comparison. Regarding that data though, where it's like economic freedom correlates with more happiness and so forth, I don't think the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. Like, keep in mind what I'm advocating. It's not like total government like Soviet control of all aspects of the economy, where they tell us how many boots to manufacture and so forth. Obviously, I'm not calling for a system like that. What I'm advocating is simply a mixed model where in certain areas there's a lot of regulation and a lot of oversight, other areas a lot more economic laxity. I don't think we should have, the government controlling all parts of the economy. So I guess my response to that would be I don't think my position is contradictory or mutually exclusive with the sort of economic freedom you talk about.
So I have an article pulled up here on my computer, uh, and this is from a website. This is from a news organization called The Local, which is a Swedish news organization. So this article's made in Sweden, from the horse's mouth. Sweden's healthcare is an embarrassment. Sweden
Okay, I
is
mean, I don't know who this author is. Like, conservatives exist in Sweden, I'm sure. People who are uninformed and wrong about the facts, I'm sure, also live in Sweden. Just pointing to one personal anecdote about a guy writing about the failings of their healthcare system doesn't nullify the overall big picture data that shows they outperform us on those key metrics.
let's see here if I can figure out, because I have the article pulled up. They do give some data. In the EHCI report, Sweden was given 761 out of 1,000 possible points, putting it between France and Portugal. Let's see here. Current survey suggests that the waiting time for family physicians and specialists in the greater Stockholm area currently appears to be up to 1 month. The councils and the Swedish Association of Local Authorities excuses are well known: shortage of doctors, large migration to urban areas, nurses fleeing the profession. Sweden has no fewer doctors than any other health professionals. There's no relationship between money supply and availability.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the source of this information is, so it's hard for me to sort of like respond to it
Right,
comprehensively,
right. This
because
is
we're sort
it's
of just having a conversation. I would just say the general point I'm making I feel like still stands. And cherry picking one article where in that one article they're cherry picking individual data points about one particular region of Sweden where things aren't going so well. Number one, I don't know if the information is accurate, and even if it is, it gets to that earlier point where it's like cherry picking this one data point where they do poorly doesn't nullify the point I'm making, where overall their system is superior. If you look at the overall key indices of what it takes to make your healthcare system do well, and if you look at those big picture analyses that compare the different countries, what you see is the United States consistently ranks near the bottom in terms of the overall performance of our healthcare system. And just sort of, I don't know, cherry picking little instances like this where it's like in this one area they're not doing poorly. I feel like you're missing the big picture.
well, even then, if you want to talk about the big picture, let's talk about it this way. Suppose that I'm healthy and I don't need as much medical insurance. In a system where I can decide for myself what my insurance should cover and what my insurance is, I can spend less on medical insurance and buy other things that I need, and my happiness will be, because even if people are happy with the system that they have now, let's I don't have the data right in front of me to scrutinize, like kind of like you said, but
Right.
I'll take it on face value that yes, people in countries with these systems are generally happier. I'll take it on face value for the sake of getting this point across. perhaps people are happy with the system they have, but that doesn't mean they there isn't anything else that they'd be happier under or anything that would possibly work better. Like people can be happy with something that's stupid or doesn't work or not that good. I mean, have people watch TMZ for crying out loud?
Yeah, so I I see the point you're making, where it's like perhaps they're happy with their current system, but maybe if we moved it in a libertarian direction, they'd be even happier. Well, if you just look at the
Correct.
data on countries that have healthcare systems more in that direction, where there's a much stronger private sector role in healthcare, and they open it up to the free market, and there's much less regulation. Those countries, like the United States in particular, consistently ranks underneath these countries. So it's like you're saying maybe if we moved in my direction, it would make them happier, but the data just doesn't seem to bear that out.
Right. Well, it's not even necessarily that the America is more free market because obviously I've explained it's not. We have nowhere near a free market of healthcare. Back when we did, the system generally worked better, and I have several sources that can use to back that up.
Yeah,
So
you said an interesting point that I think we do need to explore this, because this is, we've been talking a lot. We've been going back and forth now for quite a while about like the data on this or that question. I
right,
I think it'd be interesting to take it into a more like conceptual direction, which you kind of did in your last answer, where you were like,
sure.
well, from a matter of just like philosophy and fairness. If I'm healthy and I don't need healthcare, I can take that money and spend it in other areas. Wouldn't it be unfair for the government to tax me and have me pay for other people's healthcare if I feel like I don't need it? That's the general point you're making, right?
Correct. Specifically with in regards to happiness, because now I'm free to I now have extra resources I can use to buy something that would make me even happier. And by doing that, it's kind of a broken window fallacy, right? Like it's like because spending our money this way produces outcome that's good, doesn't quite mean that things wouldn't be better if people had more freedom to spend their money their way. Is sort of the point that I'm making.
Yeah, I guess my response would be like you could open that up to other areas of the economy, and it seems pretty ridiculous to me. Like, well, I practice fire safety protocols, and I'm not smoking cigarettes in my bed and so forth. So why do I need to pay for fire protection for other people who are irresponsible and
Yeah,
causing fires? It's like a lot of the stuff is totally out of your
yeah,
control. You could say like, I'm healthy, I don't need to pay for this. Yeah, you're healthy until you're not healthy. You're healthy until you get that cancer diagnosis, until you realize you have that disease. And then if you're not paying for healthcare, then you're totally fucked. And frankly, I feel like it's a much better system to have all of our resources pooled, it's covered, everyone's paid for. And if you have a system where the healthy people opt out, it's just going to completely fuck everybody over. Like, look at what happens in like the Medicare versus Medicare Advantage programs, where Medicare Advantage, they basically take anyone, and the private side of Medicare, where, or sorry, I have it backwards. Medicare Advantage is the private part of it, if I recall correctly. And then there's the standard Medicare, which is just like that's the government run side of it. So basically, the point I'm trying to make here is the private side of Medicare. The companies have all sorts of tricks and techniques they use to screw people over, to make sure that the healthy people don't sign up, or rather to make sure that the healthy people do sign up, and the unhealthy people, they pass them off to the government side of the program. So what ultimately ends up happening is, because a bunch of sick, unhealthy people are disincentivized from enrolling in the private side, the cost of the government program, since it's sort of like a dumping ground functionally for all these sick, unhealthy people, the cost skyrockets, the quality declines. And so the general point I'm trying to make here, I feel like I worded that very poorly. The point I'm trying to make is, when you have a system where the healthy people opt out, that just fucks the whole system over, because you need everybody contributing equally to be able to adequately fund it and provide the services.
right. So a couple things to respond. First thing, I wasn't necessarily saying healthy people wouldn't have any insurance. I was saying they'd maybe have more. What I was criticizing wasn't necessarily health insurance. Period. It's more the idea that the government steps in and says, "This is the health insurance you're buying. Whether or not you need it, here you have it." And that's sort of more what I was criticizing. I wasn't saying that healthy people. more often than not, even if healthy people weren't required to have health insurance, chances are they still have it because, like you said, unexpected shit can always happen. You may be healthy, but you can't predict when you're going to get sick. But another thing I would mention is that I feel like there's a reason that insurance companies go for healthier people rather than sick people. That's because insurance, by definition, is something you buy before you need it. If you already need it, it's kind of too late. Now, I agree that there should be a system in place to provide health care to people who can't afford it, but I don't know if it's really I don't think that's not really the point of insurance. Insurance is to protect healthy people when they get sick, if not necessarily to help people who are already sick.
Yeah, that I think reveals one of the fundamental problems with your approach. Because if you're allowing companies to exclude people who might actually need the healthcare, then you're basically setting up a system where anyone who needs to access the healthcare system is fucked and they're left out. So it seems to me that's a huge glaring flaw in your system. And regarding your point where you're like, well, what if I don't want this government system? And what if I want a lesser healthcare system? I guess my question would be if the single payer system, like what other countries have, is providing comprehensive care for everybody, where everything is taken care of, there's no like exclusions or fine prints like insurance companies have. If the care is comprehensive, no questions asked, and it's cheaper than our current system, what's the problem with that?
Well, if what you're saying, well, here's my rebuttal to that. If everything you're saying is true, if these government healthcare systems are so wonderful, then why not let me have a choice? If these systems are as wonderful as you say they are, obviously that's the system I'll choose to go with.
Yeah, that's something I made a very detailed response to the whole choice arguments. Actually responding to Democrats, interestingly enough, because it's a lot of like centrist Democrats who make that argument, like Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar. During the Democratic debates, you heard a lot of that, where they're like, well, we just let the American people choose, and then if your system truly is so good, then they'll go to that system anyway. The problem with such a system is exactly what I just outlined, where if you have these private companies that are still operational, they're going to set up all these different like tricks and strategies to where they incentivize only the healthy people to come to them, and then the dumping ground, uh, the government system becomes the dumping ground because there are all kinds of tricks they use. Like they'll have like signups for their healthcare system, for example, at places that aren't wheelchair accessible. That's just one example of something they do. Or they'll market their healthcare programs to companies where the demographics of their employees are like predominantly younger, healthier males, for example. Like they have all kinds of different tricks they use. So it might sound nice to just be like, let people choose, let them decide. But functionally, what ends up happening is that it's not actually a fair test because the private insurance companies, since all they're going after is profits, what they do is they end up making it an unfair comparison because the government system becomes a dumping ground. Because the government system isn't trying to screw people over, it's trying to help people and let everybody in. But since these private insurance companies, they can reduce their premiums artificially because if all they have are healthier people who don't need to access the healthcare system, they can make it so that like on paper you're like, oh, well, this is the cheaper system. But it's cheaper because they're not including people who actually need to access healthcare. So opening it up to where it's just like, let people choose freely, it doesn't set it up to where it's actually a fair competitive test like that.
Well, my initial response to that would be that okay, these other companies are using deceptive tactics and not using some underhanded ways to get customers. Let me go shut them down at gunpoint and stop them from competing with me. That doesn't seem like the right answer. The right answer may be to do what the free market does and actually go out there and let people know that hey, the competition isn't is being deceptive. They're not quite offering the right. So make all these arguments you're making to me to your prospective customers. That's what you do. You don't violently force your competition to shut down. You let the customers know what the competition's up to so that they'll go to you. So that's my initial response, and it doesn't quite sound unfair. Like the healthier people are choosing a system where there's less demand for it, and the sicker people are choosing a system where there's more demand for it. So prices go up where there's more demand. That doesn't seem unfair to me. That just seems like simple economics. Take it while working. More demand, higher price.
It's
That
not
doesn't
simple
seem.
economics because it's not a level playing field. Because the incentive structure is different on both sides. The government program, the incentive is to provide as many people, no matter what their underlying medical conditions are, with healthcare. Sick
Why?
people, unhealthy people, that's the incentive in what I would argue is an actual moral healthcare system where your goal is to provide people with healthcare at the lowest possible cost. On the private side, the incentive structure is completely reversed. The incentive structure for private insurance companies is to make as much money as you possibly can, charge as much as possible, while providing as little healthcare as possible. Because when you ultimately have to pay for people's healthcare, that's money that's not going towards your profits. So the incentive structure is not at all the same. On the one hand, you have the perverse model where the goal is to deny people coverage and not provide them healthcare on the private side, whereas the government system is the complete opposite. So it's not a level playing field, and the incentive structures are not the same. So it's just not the competitive sort of system that you outline there.
The incentive structure is different. Obviously, in the private sector, I have to make my customers happy or they leave. Whereas in the government, to a large extent, there's no incentive structure. Their incentive structure is whatever the hell they want it to be because you aren't free to not pay them. And a system where it's like where the private sector is barred from being able to compete with them would would probably make that worse, in my opinion. So I think that uh, that a solution where there's less competition, there's less involved there. So
Okay, yeah, so we're running short on time here. Unfortunately, there's always more to talk about, more issues to discuss, and I'm sure we'll have some future debates as well, where we can cross swords and talk about some other subjects like minimum wage and welfare programs and so forth. But for now, we're gonna have to close this out. So I'm gonna just make my closing statement, and then I'll open it up to you to have the last word,
sure,
and we'll have to engage again in the future. So I guess my
absolutely.
general closing statement on this debate would be specifically regarding healthcare. I think if you just look at how other countries compare against the United States, countries that have the systems I'm advocating for, where we move in a more progressive direction, where we move in the direction of either a heavily regulated mixed model or a flat out single payer system. On all the key metrics, overall, they tend to outperform us. They pay dramatically less for drugs, for the overall healthcare system. They pay much less to get comparable or even superior care. And if you actually investigate a lot of the talking points made regarding wait times or medical tourism or whatever it may be, you find that the data simply doesn't bear them out. And I would encourage everyone to actually investigate the claims and not just take them for granted. More generally, I think libertarianism, again, I used to be a big Ron Paul supporter. I understand the appeal of a lot of the arguments where they talk about freedom and personal responsibility and the private market will come up with solutions. Realistically, I think if you actually walk through the specifics of like how would this work, how would these private companies guard against pollution proactively rather than reactively, you see that the libertarian system does not stand up to scrutiny. I think moving in the direction of libertarianism would mean doing away with the progress we've made in terms of regulation, in terms of beneficial programs. I think it's a step in the wrong direction, not the right direction, and I would recommend people to not move us in that direction.
All right, and to close, I would like to say that first and foremost, I am no more fan of the American healthcare system than progressives. I agree that it's over expensive, it's wasteful, it burdens people a lot more than it helps. But a lot of these problems with our healthcare system did become problems until the government got involved, and I have a feeling that having more government involvement is just going to make it worse. Now, yeah, sure. Now, sure, some of these other systems may appear to work better. They may appear to cost less, or if you look at at certain metrics, it may make it look like they're happier. But certain overall broad metrics might make it look like people that are happier. But when you talk to people who actually deal with these systems, when you actually talk to people about their experience with the NHS and similar systems, their opinions may quite not match up. And in my opinion, if you look at the time before government got involved with healthcare, before the FDA and the AMA and all these regulations, we had charity doctors, we had mutual aid societies, we had medicine which was super cheap, and that's sort of what I would like. That's sort of what I would like to do. And now, speaking of libertarianism in general, libertarianism is an anti-progress. On the contrary, I think a system that's where people are able to innovate, to find solutions, that people are free to work things out for themselves. That produces progress, that enables progress. Way more in a system where you have a bureaucracy just kind of taking people's money and dictating to people what to do. And of course, progress. I think a lot of the stuff that you call progress, like regulations and uh, social programs, I think this is illusory progress. It's something that seems like progress, but when you really break it down and look at the real effects it's having, you see that it's a lot. It can be potentially regressive compared to a lot of free market solutions. And progress, it can take many different forms. Progress isn't a single path. Progress is a branching tree, and that's the advantage of the free market. You can try different. What progress means for one person may be different from what progress means for another person. It's a big, beautiful tree with branches, and everyone can just pick the branch and do what works for them. And that's sort of my summarization of my take on it.
Awesome. Well, I think it was a great debate. I
Same thing.
enjoyed engaging with you for these two debates, and we'll
Absolutely.
have to do it again because there's always more ground to cover, more subjects to get to.
Absolutely.
But
Right.
thanks for showing up and joining me in the battle of ideas, so to speak.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Anton. I appreciate these conversations. And not, we don't agree obviously, but I think we do get along pretty well when we have these debates, and I do enjoy it.